The bond was 4 pages long, and Thomasin Reeve had ruled every line of it herself. She had ruled them in the counting house above the quay at Bridgewater, on the last Thursday of November in the year 1816, with the tide going out below the window, and the smell of wet grain coming up through the floorboards. She had ruled them because her father's clerk had a palsy in his right hand that winter and could no longer keep a straight margin. She had ruled them because she was faster than the clerk had ever been. And she had ruled them because Josiah Reeve had long since stopped pretending that his second daughter was anything other than the best pair of hands in his business, whatever he said about her at his own dinner table. The name at the head of the bond was Gideon Vaux, Earl of Cadmoor. The sum was £4,200. The consideration was wheat, barley and beans, delivered by waggon in 11 loads between the 8th of October and the 22nd of November, out of her father's warehouses on the river, at prices that had risen every single week since the summer had failed to come. Thomasin knew those prices better than any man in that town, because she had written them into the book as they climbed. In an ordinary year, good wheat went at 9 or 10 shillings the bushel. That autumn, it had gone to 18, and then to 22. And there were men in the Bridgewater Exchange who said cheerfully, over their brandy, that it would touch 30 before Lady Day, and that a man who held his stock would be made for life. Her father was one of them. He has not paid a farthing, Josiah Reeve said, coming in from the stairs, with the cold still on his coat. Not a farthing, Thomasin, and 11 loads gone up that hill. He has paid 300, she said, without looking up, in October, in coin, out of his own hand, on the quay. I entered it. 300 against 4,200 is a courtesy, not a payment. It is still an entry. Her father took the chair on the other side of the desk, which was where he always sat when he had already decided a thing and wanted it agreed with. He was 61, broad in the shoulder, going soft in the jaw, and he had built the largest corn factorage between Bristol and Exeter out of nothing but nerve and an unshakable belief that a full warehouse in a hungry country was the nearest thing on earth to a mine of silver. I am stopping the grain, he said. Thomasin set the pen down. It was the first time she had stopped writing since he came in. You cannot stop the grain. I can stop anything that leaves my own yard. You have a contract to deliver 9 more loads before the 1st of February. I have a contract with a man who does not pay, and a bond I may enforce whenever I please, and half the county saying he will be sold up before Candlemas in any case. Her father spread his hands, reasonable, aggrieved, entirely certain of himself. Thomasin, I am not a hard man. I have carried him further than any factor in the West would have carried him. But there is a limit, and the limit is £4,200. And Stenock? What of Stenock? There are 311 people in the parish of Stenock, she said, and every one of them is eating off those waggons. Her father looked at her the way he looked at a customer who had raised an inconvenient point. That is not my affair. That is the parish's affair, and if a parish will not feed its own, that is what a poor rate is for. The poor rate at Stenock is 4 pence in the pound, and the vestry has spent it. How can you possibly know that? Because I read the county paper, and because I keep your books, and because I have seen what the Earl of Cadmoor has been buying, and I have seen what he has been doing with it. He is not reselling it. 11 loads have gone up that hill, and not one bushel has come back down to any market in Somerset. He is giving it away." There was a silence in the counting house. Below, on the quay, a man was swearing steadily at a horse. "Then he is a fool," her father said at last, "and fools go to the wall, and I should like to be paid before he gets there." She could have argued. She had argued before about smaller things, and she had learned what arguing bought her in that house: a raised voice, a slammed door, and the same result 3 days later, delivered as though it had been his own idea all along. So she did not argue. She turned the bond around on the desk so that it faced him, and she said, "Then let me offer you a better security than a ruined man's promise." That is how it began. Not with a carriage, not with a veil, not with a father's cruelty. It began with a woman of 24 in an ink-stained sleeve, turning a piece of paper around on a desk. Her mother had left her £3,000 in the 4% to come to her at 25 or upon her marriage, whichever should fall first. It was the only money in the world that was truly hers, and her father had been waiting for it as patiently as a man waits for fruit to ripen on a wall. £3,000 discharges the greater part of the bond on the day of the wedding, she said. The balance you may take in a fresh note at 4%, payable at Michaelmas next, and I will stand surety for it out of my own settlement. You will have your money. You will keep your customer. And you will have got a coronet into the family, which I know quite well is what you have wanted since Cordelia married her banker and made you feel small at your own table. Her father's face went through several expressions, and none of them was refusal. "You have never met him," he said. "No, he is, Thomasin. You have heard what he is. I have heard what the county says he is. They say he fired his own granary. They say a great many things. They say he did it for the insurance, and that the money went into his pocket, and that the whole business of the free corn is a piece of theatre to cover it." Her father leaned forward. "And they say he came out of that fire with half his face gone, that his own servants will not look at him, that the last woman who was to have married him took one look and went home to Bath in the same carriage she came in. Then he will not be difficult to persuade," Thomasin said. It was a hard thing to say, and she said it evenly, because she had learned very young that the only way to say a hard thing about yourself in that house was to say it first, and briskly, before anybody else could get to it. She was not a beauty. She had been told so, kindly and unkindly, since she was 15. She was small and sallow and short-sighted. She had a plain brown head of hair that would hold no curl in damp weather, which in Somerset is most weather. She had a habit of looking at people half a second longer than was comfortable. And she had ink on the first 2 fingers of her right hand every day of her life, which is a mark of trade, and which no amount of lemon or pumice would ever quite take off. At Cordelia's wedding breakfast, a woman from Clifton had asked her, not unkindly, whether she was the companion. But she could hold a column of 40 figures in her head. She could look at a page of a stranger's accounts and tell you, in a quarter of an hour, where the man was lying. And she had spent 2 months watching a burnt earl buy grain at famine prices with money he plainly did not have, and give it away to a parish that despised him, and never once say why. And she had found, somewhere in the middle of all those neat entries in her own hand, that she wanted very badly to know what kind of man that was. "You would be marrying a ruin," her father said. I would be marrying a customer, said Thomasin. You have always told me it is the same thing. He laughed at that. He could never help laughing when she cut at him. Then he was quiet for a while, and then he said, in a smaller voice than she had heard him use in years, Your mother would have had my head. My mother, Thomasin said, would have read the bond. She wrote the articles herself over the following 4 days. Marriage articles are commonly drawn by 2 attorneys who dislike one another and are paid by the hour to prove it. Thomasin drew hers in a fair round secretary hand at the counting-house desk, and only sent them at the end to Mr. Coker in 4 Street to be looked over. Mr. Coker looked them over for 2 hours and altered 11 words, and told her father afterwards, with the air of a man reporting a portent, that he had never in 30 years seen a settlement drawn by a woman that he could not improve. There were 9 articles. 8 of them concerned money. The 9th she added on the last evening, alone with the candle going down and the tide coming in under the window, and it said this, that the said Thomasin Reeve should have the keeping of the household books of Cadmoor, and free access to all accounts, bills, receipts, and vouchers of the estate, from the day of the marriage. She did not entirely know then why she wrote it. She told herself it was prudence. A woman marrying into debt should be able to see the debt. That article would, in the end, save a man's name, a parish, and the whole of the rest of her life. But she did not know that yet. That night it was only the last line on the last page, written small because she was running out of paper, in a hand that shook very slightly from the cold. The answer from Cadmoor came back on the 4th of December, and it was 1 line long. I accept your terms, madam, and am sorry for them. Cadmoor. She went up to Stenick on the 11th of December, in weather that had already begun to frighten people. It had been a wrong year from the beginning. There had been snow on the Quantocks in June. There had been frost in July that took the beans in the field. The hay had rotted where it stood, the wheat had come in thin and sprouted and black at the ear, and the sun all that summer had hung in a strange dry haze like a coin seen through water, so that old women in the villages said the world was ending and were not entirely laughed at. Then October had turned bitter early, and November had turned worse, and by the 2nd week of December the lanes above the levels were floored with ice, and the roads had begun to close one by one, the way doors close in a house when the wind gets in. The chaise took 4 hours to go 18 miles. Twice the postboy got down and led the horses. At the top of the last hill, where the road came out of the trees and the whole moor opened grey and white in front of them, he stopped altogether and turned round in the saddle and said, "That's it, ma'am. That's Cadmoor." Thomasin looked and counted, because she counted when she was frightened. It was a habit from her mother's illness, from sitting on a stair and counting the spindles in the banister so as not to hear what was happening upstairs. She had never lost it. She counted 17 windows across the front of the house. She counted 11 of them without glass. Cadmoor was a long, handsome, honey-coloured house of the last century, set back behind a court with 2 stone piers, and it looked from that distance exactly like what it was, a great house that something had been taken out of. There was no smoke from the west end. There were pale scars on the stonework where a balustrade had been lifted away. And when the chaise came in at last between the piers, over gravel that had gone soft and grassy from want of use, Thomasin saw that the front doors were gone. Not open. Gone. There were 2 great empty jambs, and the hinge-pins standing up in the stone, and beyond them a hall full of white winter light, and a housekeeper in a black dress, standing in that light with her hands folded, waiting in the wind. "My lady," the housekeeper said, "I am Mrs. Peel. You are very welcome." It was said with such perfect composure, in a doorway with no door in it, that Thomasin liked her immediately. "Mrs. Peel, thank you. Where are the doors?" Mrs. Peel did not blink. "Sold at Wexley, my lady, on the 6th of November, along with the inner doors of the west range, the stair rail, 4 chimney pieces, the glass out of the long gallery, and the lead off the laundry roof." "And the pictures?" The pictures went first. She could see that they had. The hall at Cadmoor was 40 feet long, and the walls were panelled in pale grey-green paint, and up and down that panelling, at intervals, were rectangles of a slightly different, slightly fresher colour. Where paint had stood for 50 years behind a frame and never been touched by the light. There were 9 of them. They looked like windows into another and better fed house. There was no furniture in the hall except a table, a bench, and at the far end, a very large pair of iron scales. "Those are new," Thomasin said. "Those are the parish scales, my lady. His lordship weighs at that end on Tuesdays and Fridays." "Weighs what?" "Whatever there is," said Mrs. Peel. And then a doorway rather, an arch with no door in it, at the far end of the hall was filled, and the Earl of Cadmoor came in out of the white light with his hat in his hand, and Thomasin Reeve got her first look at the man the whole county called a monster. He was very tall. That was the first thing. He was 33 years old, black-haired, in a plain black coat that had been a good coat 3 years ago, with a white cravat tied very neatly at the throat, and he came down the hall in mud-splashed boots, like a man interrupted in the middle of doing something heavy. The burn ran up the left side of his neck, out of the collar, across the jaw, and stopped just short of the eye. It was old enough to have gone silver pink at the edges, and it had pulled the corner of his mouth a little out of true, so that the left side of his face did not move quite as the right side did. The back of his left hand was the same, and he wore a glove on that hand indoors, and had not, that day, remembered to take it off. He stopped 6 feet away, which she understood later was exactly the distance at which people generally stopped flinching. "Miss Reeve, Lord Cadmoor, I am sorry you have had that road. I have had worse roads. Not this year you have not," he said, and there was for a quarter of a second something at the corner of the mouth that did not move properly, which she was almost certain had been the beginning of a smile. Then it was gone. "You will want a fire. There is 1 fire lit in this house between 10 in the morning and 8 at night, and it is in the small parlour, and I have had it lit for you since noon. Mrs. Peel will take you. Thank you. You should also know," he said, "before you take off your cloak, that everything you have been told about me is being said in earnest. It is not gossip that will wear off. There are men in this county who believe I burned 300 quarters of wheat in October for the money, and they will believe it in 10 years, and they will say it in front of you. And some of them will say it to you. You have made a very poor bargain, and it will not be improved by good manners. If you wish to go back down that hill tomorrow, the horses are yours, and there will be no reproach from me, and no word of it from anyone in this house. He said it flatly, the way a man reads out a list. Thomasin took her time. She was aware of Mrs. Peel standing very still by the wall, and of the cold coming in through the doorway that had no door, and of the 9 pale rectangles on the panelling. "Did you burn it?" she said. Nobody in 14 months had asked him directly. She learned that afterwards. It went through him visibly, like a knock on a bruise. "No," he said. "Then I will keep my cloak off," said Thomasin, "and I should like to see the account books before dinner." They were married on the 16th of December in the parish church at Stenick at 10 in the morning, by licence. It was not a wedding anybody would put in a book. It rained in the night and froze at dawn, and there was a sheet of black ice from the light gate to the porch, and Thomasin came the last 200 yards on foot, because the chaise horse would not keep its feet on the hill, so that she arrived at her own wedding with the wet to her knees, her boots grey with road ice, her bonnet ribbon torn where the wind had had it, and her hair coming down on one side in flat, dark strings. There was no wedding dress. She was married in a grey stuff travelling gown with a black spencer over it, because her boxes had gone into the ditch below Wexley and would not be got out until Wednesday. Her father came and was loud, and shook hands with the churchwardens as though he had bought them too. Her sister Cordelia did not come. Cordelia wrote instead, from Clifton, a letter of 4 sides which contained the word unfortunate 9 times, and ended with the assurance that if Thomasin should ever wish to come away quietly, there would always be a bed and no questions asked, though of course the situation could not be received in Bristol. And the parish came. That was the thing Thomasin had not expected. The church was full, not with well-wishers, but with 140 people in wet wool, who had walked in from the outlying farms in that weather to look at the woman the burnt Earl had bought, and who stood through the whole service in a silence that had nothing kind in it. When Gideon Vaux put the ring on her finger, a man at the back said something, not quietly, and 3 or 4 people laughed, and the curate raised his voice and went on. She did not hear what was said. She heard the laugh. She found that her hand had closed on his, and that it had closed hard, and that she had done it before she had decided to do it. His fingers were rigid inside the glove. He did not look round at the church. He looked down at their 2 hands for a moment, at her ink-stained fingers on his black glove, with an expression she could not read at all. Then he said, very quietly, so that only she and God and the curate could hear it, "You need not do that." "Madam, I am aware," said Thomasin. And she did not let go. There were 4 servants at Cadmoor, in a house built to be run by 30. Mrs. Peel kept the house, and had been in it since she was 17. Barrow kept the estate. He had been a bombardier of artillery, and had left his right arm in Spain. And he wrote his accounts left-handed in a large, slow, beautiful copperplate that took him twice as long as anybody else, and was twice as legible. There was a cook called Sarah Doggett, who had come back to the house in October without being asked, and had never once mentioned wages. And there was a young man of 19 named Kitto Trewin, who did the horses, the fires, the waggon, and anything else that was left over, and who slept in the harness loft, because it was warmer than the servants' hall. The rest of the household had gone in the summer, and they had not been turned off. Thomasin found that in the book in Barrow's copperplate, on her second morning, every one of them paid to the day with a month over, and a character written out, and, in 11 cases, a place found for them in another house before they went. It had cost £260 that the estate did not have. She sat with that page for some time. She had asked for the books before dinner on her first night, and had been given them without argument, which surprised her, and she had been reading them ever since. There were 19 volumes, and 4 boxes of loose vouchers, and by the end of her first week at Cadmoor, she had been through all of them once, and by the end of the second she had begun to build, on the long table in the cold library where the shelves stood empty, a thing she thought of privately as the true account. Because the books lied, not from dishonesty, from modesty, which in bookkeeping amounts to the same nuisance. Gideon Vaux entered what he spent, and did not enter what it cost him. There would be a line reading corn, Reeve of Bridgewater 200 quarters, and nothing at all to say that on the same day a canaletto had gone out of the dining parlour in a cart under a tarpaulin. The sale bills were in a box, unentered, in no order, some of them still folded in the auctioneer's cover. Thomasin unfolded them, and laid them out, and began to enter them. Wexley, 6th of November. Lot 41, a pair of carved and gilt doors, the property of a nobleman, sold £9.10. £12 for a chimney-piece by Wilton that had cost his grandfather 90. £480 for the library, 2,200 volumes, sold in 11 lots to a dealer from Bath, who bought the whole for less than the shelves had cost. £51 for the lead. 16 guineas for a mare he had bred himself. By the 20th of December she had reached, in her own fair round hand, a figure that made her put the pen down and sit back in the cold library and look at the empty shelves for a long while. Between the 15th of October and the 1st of December, Gideon Vaux had turned £14,230 of a house into bread. "You are cold, my lady," said Mrs. Peel from the door. "I am not particularly. You have been in here since 8, and there is no fire in this room." "Mrs. Peel, sit down a moment." Thomasin turned a sale bill round on the table. The doors of this house went for £9.10. £9.10 buys, what, at present prices? 6 quarters of barley? Something near it, my lady. And how far does 6 quarters of barley go in this parish? Mrs. Peel did not have to think about it. 2 days, she said. There is a thing that happens to a person when a number stops being a number. Thomasin had spent 9 years with figures, and had always been proud of the coolness of them. She had told her father once that a ledger was the only honest thing in the world, because it could not be flattered. She sat in the cold library at Cadmoor with a bundle of auctioneer's bills in front of her, and understood, for the first time in her life, that a ledger can also be a kind of confession, if you know how to read it, and that this one was the confession of a man who had taken his house apart with his hands, in the dark, 2 days at a time. She looked up at the empty shelves. Then she picked up the pen and went on entering, because that was what she was for. I want to say something here, before the weather closes in on this story properly, because from this point the road only goes one way. If you have come this far with Thomasin, stay with her, and subscribe so that you can. What happens in that parish between Christmas and the end of January is the part of this that I have most wanted to tell, and she is going to need somebody watching. On the Friday, she went down to the dole. It was held at the market cross at Stenick. which is a squat weathered stone thing with 4 steps and a shaft, standing in the middle of the village street, and it had been the place where corn was measured in that parish since before anybody could say. The waggon came down from the house at 8. Barrow drove, Kitto walked at the horses' heads, and the scales came down with it on a hurdle, roped upright. Thomasin walked down beside the waggon in the same grey stuff gown, with a ledger under her arm and a lead pencil, because ink froze. There were 200 and some people waiting in the street. They had been waiting since before it was light. She saw women with sacking tied over their shoes. She saw a man of about 70 standing perfectly upright and perfectly silent, with a bowl held in front of him in both hands as though he were at communion. And she saw how it was done. Gideon Vaux stood at the scales himself. He weighed every portion himself. With the glove off, she noticed that he took the glove off to work, and he did not weigh short and he did not weigh generous. He weighed exactly, and he let the person watch the beam, and when the beam came level he said the person's name. Mrs. Yeo, 8 pounds. Thank you, my lord. Mr. Gollop, 14. There are 5 of you. 6 now, my lord. A pause. 16 then, and to Barrow without turning, enter 6 at Gollop's. He knew all of them. 311 people, and he knew all of them, and what he did not know he asked. It took 4 hours. Nobody was hurried, and nobody was preached at, and nobody was made to say anything about their circumstances, which Thomasin, who had watched her father's charity, understood at once was the rarest thing in the whole arrangement. And they hated him. That was the part she could not make fit. They came up to the scales and took the corn from his hands and said, "Thank you, my lord," and went away, and the moment his back was turned, the faces changed. Not all of them, perhaps a third of them. But that third stood in the street in the cold and watched him weigh, and their faces said plainly and without any effort at concealment that they knew where the money had come from, and that they were eating a burnt granary, and that it was a hard thing to take bread out of the hand that had struck the match. At 11 o'clock a stout man in a good drab greatcoat came out of the Ram and crossed the street and stood at the foot of the cross with his thumbs in his waistcoat, watching, and said nothing at all for 20 minutes, which was somehow the loudest thing anybody did that morning. "Who is that?" Thomasin asked Barrow. "Mr. Silas Sperrin, my lady, overseer of the poor for the parish. Vestry clerk. He was agent to the late lord, to your husband's brother, to his lordship's brother. Aye, 14 years. And what does he want?" Barrow, who had been an artilleryman and did not waste words, said the scales, my lady, and went to hold the horse. They did not live as married people. That had been Article 6, and she had drawn it herself. Separate apartments, no claim on either side, the arrangement to stand for a year and then be spoken of. What she had not drawn, and could not have drawn, was the rest of it. She found, in her first fortnight, that a fire was always lit in the small parlour by the time she came down, though the house had one fire, and it was supposed to be lit at 10. She found her chair moved, quietly, over 4 days, from the draught to the warm side of the hearth, and no one would admit to having moved it. She found a rushlight left burning at the turn of the back stairs, because she had said once in passing that the stairs at Cadmoor were very dark and she had counted them wrong twice. She found on the 23rd of December a pair of shoes at her door, strong country shoes with double soles, made in the village, exactly her size, and she had never given her size to anybody in that house. She thought about that for a while, and then remembered him looking at her boots in the church porch on their wedding morning, grey to the ankle, ruined. He was not gentle in his manner. He was the reverse of gentle. He spoke in short, flat sentences and often did not speak at all. He was out of the house before light most days, and came back after dark with the cold in his coat. He never took the glove off at table, and never once, in those first weeks, sat where the candle would fall on the left side of his face. But he had bought her shoes, and he had bought them out of a house that had no doors. On Christmas Eve she came into the hall and found him at the table with the parish book, and she sat down opposite him without asking, and opened her own ledger. And they worked for an hour and a half in silence, and at the end of it he said, "You have a better hand than my brother's man ever had." "I have a better hand than most men in Bridgewater." "Yes," he said, "I can see that." That was all. She thought about it for 2 days. On the 28th she asked Mrs. Peel straight out what people meant when they spoke of Nine Springs. Mrs. Peel was folding sheets. She went on folding them. "Nine Springs is a cottage, my lady, on the old drift road above the Coombe. It is nearly 2 miles. And who lives there?" "I could not say." "Mrs. Peel, I could not say, my lady," said Mrs. Peel, "and I would rather you did not ask Barrow, who would tell you a lie, and be sorry for it, and think less of himself for a year." So Thomasin did not ask Barrow. She asked Kitto Trewin, who was 19 and had no defences at all, and Kitto went red to the ears and said that his lordship rode up to Nine Springs 2 or 3 nights in the week, and had done since the summer, and that there was a woman kept there, and that everyone in Stenock knew it, and that he himself did not believe a word of it, and would her ladyship please not say he had spoken. Thomasin said that she would not. She went upstairs and sat on the end of her bed in the cold with her hands in her lap, and discovered that she minded. That was inconvenient. She had drawn the articles herself, she had had no expectations, she had married a ledger and a coronet, and a man who had been perfectly honest with her in a doorway with no door in it. She had no earthly right to mind. She minded anyway, and she was too honest a bookkeeper to enter it as anything else. Then, on the 3rd of January, Ambrose Kiteley was found dead on the Stenock Road. He was 71 years old. He had been a hedger all his life, and latterly a mole-catcher, and he lived alone in a 1-room cottage at the top of the Coombe, with no fire in it, and he was found at 7:45 in the morning by a carter, sitting up against the wall at the turn below the drift road, about 400 yards from his own door, with an empty meal bag folded under his arm. He had been dead since some time in the night. There had been 11 degrees of frost. The coroner for the 100, Mr. Thirlwall, was written to on the 4th. He came over from Wexley on the 7th, and viewed the body at the Ram, and swore a jury of 14 men, and opened the inquest, and adjourned it at once to the 9th, for want of evidence. And by the evening of the 7th, everybody within 9 miles knew what the evidence was going to be. The evidence was going to be that Ambrose Kiteley had walked 2 miles down to the market cross on the Friday, the 2nd of January, with his bag, and had come away empty, and had died walking home. There had been no dole on the 2nd of January. Thomasin learned that in the kitchen, from Sarah Doggett, in the flat voice people use for a thing that has already been decided elsewhere. There was no waggon on the Friday, Sarah said. First Friday since October there's been no waggon. Why not? Because his lordship never come down, said Sarah, and Barrow won't weigh without him, and Mr. Sperrin sent word to the cross at 11 that there'd be nothing that day, and they all went home. Where was he? Sarah Doggett looked at the fire and did not answer. The inquest resumed on the 9th of January in the long assembly chamber of the Ram at Stenock, which was the only public place in the parish big enough, and which had a low ceiling and a chimney that smoked, and 200 people standing in it and along the passage and out into the yard. Thomasin sat on a bench at the side with Mrs. Peel beside her. Mr. Thirlwall was a small, dry man of 60 with a heavy cold and no interest whatever in theatre. He had held inquests on drowned sailors and crushed miners for 26 years, and he ran his court like a man doing arithmetic. He heard the carter. He heard the surgeon, who said death by cold, no marks of violence, the stomach entirely empty. He heard Kitely's neighbour, a woman called Hannah Pepin, who said that Ambrose had gone down to the cross on the Friday morning, saying he had nothing left in the house at all, and had come back past her door at about noon with the bag folded up, and had said she was very careful to give the exact words. "There is no corn today, Hannah, and there is to be none Tuesday, neither." "Who told him there was to be none on the Tuesday?" said the coroner. "He said it was Mr. Sperrin told them at the cross, sir." And then Mr. Sperrin was sworn, and stood up in his good drab greatcoat, and gave his evidence in the voice of a man who had rehearsed it in front of a glass. He was, he said, overseer of the poor for the parish of Stenock, and had been these 9 years. He was sorry to say that the relief of the parish had for some months past been taken entirely out of the hands of the vestry, where the law had placed it, and conducted instead by his lordship the Earl of Cadmoor as a private benevolence, upon his lordship's own scales, at his lordship's own hours, upon his lordship's own whim. He, Sperrin, had objected to it from the first. A parish, he said, must be able to depend. A poor man must know that on Friday there will be corn, and it must not rest upon whether a gentleman is at home, or is abroad, or is otherwise engaged. And on Friday the 2nd of January, said the coroner. There was no corn, sir. Why was there none? Because his lordship did not come, said Sperrin. He let it sit. He was clever. He did not push it. He simply stood there, with his thumbs in his waistcoat, and let 200 people in a smoky chamber arrive at the rest of it themselves. Was there corn in the house at Cadmoor that day? The coroner asked. That, sir, I could not say. His lordship keeps no account that the vestry may inspect. Thomasin heard herself say, quite clearly, in the silence, that is not true. Every head in the room came round. Mr. Thirlwall lifted his eyes from his notes and looked at her over his spectacles, without any particular expression, and said, Madam, you are not sworn, and I will not have speeches. If you have evidence, you may give it on the 16th, upon oath like anybody else. I shall, said Thomasin. Then sit down. She sat down. Her ears were roaring. Beside her, Mrs. Peel reached over without looking and put a hand flat on top of hers, the way you steady a book that is about to slide off a table. And on the far side of the chamber, standing against the wall with his hat in his hand and the whole room's attention on him, and his face perfectly still, Gideon Vaux looked at his wife for a long moment, and then looked away, and said nothing at all in his own defense. He did not say where he had been on the 2nd of January. He was not going to. They did not speak of it on the road back. They spoke of it in the hall at Cadmoor, standing up, with their coats still on, in the last of the light coming through the doorway that had no door. "You will not give evidence," he said. "I shall." Thomasin, it was the first time he had used her name. She noticed it and put it away to be looked at later, the way she put away everything that year. "You do not understand what Speran is doing. He is not trying to hang me. He knows quite well no jury of this parish will return a verdict against a peer. He does not want one. He wants 3 words in the coroner's finding. He wants the words want of relief. If those words go up to the bench at the quarter sessions, the magistrates take the corn out of my hands and put it into the vestries, and the vestry is Speran, and I have no more standing to interfere in it than the man who sweeps the road. And then? And then he sells it," said Gideon, "as he has been selling it since October. There is grain going out of this parish at night, and it is not going out of my yard. He takes the relief corn at the price the vestry pays for it, and he puts it on a boat at Combwich, and it goes to Bristol at market. He cannot do it while I am standing at those scales, because they come to me and not to him. So he requires me to be found unfit, publicly, on oath, in front of them all." Thomasin was quiet for a moment. "You could prove that." "With what?" "With his accounts. His accounts are the vestry's accounts, and they are perfect. I have seen them. He is not a fool, he is a clerk. Every bushel he has ever bought is entered, and every bushel is entered as issued." He moved his shoulders. "Once, you would need to prove what went out of the parish, not what came in. You would need the other side of it, and the other side of it is in a boat." "Or in a factor's book," said Thomasin. He looked at her. "Grain that leaves this county by water," she said, "is sold to somebody. And whoever buys it enters it, because a corn factor who does not enter what he buys is out of business in a year. There is a purchase note for every one of those cargoes sitting in a counting house somewhere between here and Bristol, and every note has a name on it, and a date, and a weight. Whose counting house?" "That," said Thomasin, "is the question I intend to answer." He was silent. Then he said, "You would be setting your own trade against you." "I would be reading a ledger," she said. "It is the only thing I do well." There were 7 days until the 16th. She spent 5 of them on the road with him, and that was her doing too, she said on the 10th, that if she was to swear to the state of the parish, she had better see the parish, and that she would go with the waggon, and that he might come or not as he chose. He came. They went out at first light, and were out until dark 5 days running, up the drift road and over the Coombe to the outlying farms where nobody had come down to the cross since the snow. It was the hardest work of Thomasin's life. She held the horse's head on the slopes. She carried meal bags to doors. She got a boot full of water at the ford below Nether Cadmoor and walked 4 miles in it, and could not feel the foot at the end. And she learned the parish, house by house, the way she had learned her father's book, by entering it. She learned that at Hardy's, on the ridge, there were 9 people in 3 rooms and 1 blanket among them, and that his lordship had sent up the last of the stable rugs in November. She learned that old Mrs. Yeo had been getting 8 pounds of meal a week since October, and had been giving 3 of it to the family next door, and that his lordship had known this for 2 months, and had quietly made it 11, and never said why. She learned that when the roof came off the linhay at Prowse's in the December gale, it had been rethatched inside 4 days by 2 men from Wexley, paid in coin, and that when Prowse tried to thank him, his lordship had said, "It is my roof," and ridden away, which the family found unfriendly, and Thomasin found almost unbearable. And she learned what had happened on the night of the granary. She learned it from a man called Job Netley, at a cottage on the edge of the burnt ground, on the 14th of January, in the afternoon, with the light going. Netley was 40, and had been a carter. He had been in the granary at Stenock on the night of the 8th of October, sleeping in the loft over the corn as he had every harvest for 20 years. And he had come out of it alive, and he had come out of it deaf, not partly. Entirely there had been a beam and a roof fall, and a noise, and after the noise there had been nothing at all, ever again. Nobody in the parish talked to Job Netley any more. They had tried for a week or two the way people do, shouting into his face and then giving it up. By January, they simply did things around him. Thomasin sat down on the settle opposite him, took the ledger out from under her arm, opened it at a clean page, and wrote in her fair round hand, large, "Mr. Netley, I am Lady Cadmoor. May I ask you about the fire?" She turned it round. He read it. Then he looked up at her, and for a moment he could not do anything with his face at all. He was a big, slow, gentle-looking man, with a scar of his own across the scalp, and he sat there in his own cottage, and looked at a page of writing turned round to face him, and his eyes went red. Afterwards, she understood that in 98 days she was the first person who had thought of it. He could not write much. He could sign his name and make out print slowly. So they did it half in writing and half in his hands, and it took 2 hours, and Gideon stood in the doorway the whole time with his hat in his hands and did not once interrupt. This is what Job Netley told her. There was no fire in the granary at 8 o'clock. He would swear it. He had been up in the loft and had come down for his supper, and there was no fire. The doors on the yard side were open at 9, which they should not have been, because he had barred them at 6. There were 2 waggons in the yard at 9 o'clock, loading, in the dark, without lanterns, which is a thing no honest man does with corn. He came down and asked what they were about, and a man he knew perfectly well, a man he had carted for, told him to go back up and hold his tongue, and there would be 5 shillings in it. He went back up. He was ashamed of that. He made her write it down that he had gone back up. At about 11 the fire began, and it began at the yard end, in the empty bays, where the 2 waggons had been. And when the roof came in on him, and he was lying under a beam, with his ears full of blood and no notion which way was out, somebody came up the burning stair for him, and got a hand under his arms, and dragged him the length of the loft, and put him out of the loading door onto the sacks below, and then went back in for the last of the corn, because the corn was the parish's winter. I know it were him, Job Netley said aloud, in the flat, unmodulated voice of a man who can no longer hear himself, and he was crying by then, and not troubling about it. I know it were him, missus, because I had a hold of his hand, and it were burning. Thomasin wrote, "Did you say this at the time?" Netley shook his head slowly. Why not? He took the pencil, and it took him a long minute, and he wrote 4 words. No one asked me. That night he went out again. She heard the horse in the court at a little after 9. She had been sitting up in the small parlour with the sale bills and Job Netley's account written out fair, and she heard the hooves go across the frozen gravel and out between the piers. and she put the pen down and sat for perhaps 4 minutes. Then she got up and put on her cloak and the strong country shoes with the double soles that somebody had left at her door on the 23rd of December, and she walked 2 miles up the drift road in the dark. There was a moon on the snow, which was the only reason it was possible. It took her 50 minutes. Twice she stopped and counted her own breaths until they came even. Nine Springs was a 2-room cottage under a bank, with a thorn, hedge, and a byre, and there was a light in the window and a horse tied under the lean-to with a rug over it that had been a stable rug at Cadmoor. She stood in the lane and looked at the light for a long moment, and she thought, "You have no right to this. You drew the articles yourself. You have no claim and no expectation and no business here." Then she went and knocked. The door opened, and it was not a housekeeper and it was not a servant. It was a woman of perhaps 30, in a plain wrapper, with her hair down her back, very thin, with the fine dry skin of somebody who has been badly ill and is not yet well, holding a candle in a hand that was not entirely steady. She looked at Thomasin. She looked at the cloak and the shoes and the ledger under the arm. She had brought the ledger. She could not have said why. She had brought it the way another woman might have brought a knife. And the thin woman said, with a kind of exhausted amusement, "Oh, thank God. He said you were clever." Her name was Lydia. She had been the wife of Tobias Vaux, 6th Earl of Cadmoor, since the 9th of June, 1814, and she was his widow since the 3rd of April, 1815, and there was not one soul in the county of Somerset who knew it, except the man tying a rug over a horse in the yard. They sat in the small room with the fire made up, and Lydia Vaux told it, wrapped in a shawl, coughing every few minutes, in the plain, unhurried voice of a woman who had had 20 months to get the order of it right. Tobias had married her in Ireland, while his regiment was at Fermoy. She was a surgeon's widow, with no fortune and no family. He was 39, and heir to nothing yet, and perfectly happy. When his father died, and the title came to him, he brought her back to England and put her at Nine Springs for a season, only for a season, he said, until he had the estate straight, and then he sat down with the estate books for the first time in his life, and found what 14 years of Silas Sperrin had done to them. He had signed everything, Lydia said. That is what you must understand about Tobias. He signed what was put in front of him for 14 years, because a gentleman does not check his own agent. Rentals, leases, notes of hand, a mortgage on the Wexley farms that he could not remember making and I believe never did make. Sperrin had his hand off by heart. When Tobias finally added it up and understood that he had been eaten alive, and that if he prosecuted, every one of those signatures would be read out in a court, and every creditor in the West would see how the estate was managed, and it would all come down within the month, he could not do it. He was not a strong man. He was a kind, weak, generous man who could not bear to be laughed at. So he did nothing. He drank instead, and he did it very thoroughly, and in 11 months it killed him. And you? And I was a secret he had not got round to telling, said Lydia. There was no settlement. There is no jointure. There is a certificate in a parish register in County Cork and a ring and my word. She smiled slightly. Gideon came home from the peninsula to a title, a mortgage he could not account for, an agent he could not remove without a suit that would ruin the tenants, and a sister-in-law in a cottage that nobody knew about. He could have put you aside. Nobody would ever have known. He gave me the cottage, £40 a year, and his brother's name every time he speaks to me. Lydia said. And when I said I would go away to Ireland and stop being a trouble to him, he lost his temper for the only time I have seen, and said that the last thing his brother ever asked him for was to look after me, and that he would be damned before he made a liar of a dead man. Thomasin sat still. Why does he hide you? Because Sperrin knows, said Lydia. Sperrin has known since the spring. He came up that lane in April and sat in that chair and explained to me, very civilly, what he would do if I ever opened my mouth about the estate accounts. I saw the books, you see. In the last month, when Tobias was past caring, he showed me everything. I am the only living person besides Sperrin who has seen the old rentals, and Sperrin burned those in the autumn. She coughed and waited it out. So he told me what he would swear, that I was Tobias's kept woman and not his wife, and the register is in Cork, and it would take a year and money. We have not got to prove otherwise. That I had the Cadmoor plate off a dying man. There is enough of it missing to hang the story on, because Sperrin took it himself. He would have me indicted at the assizes, Lady Cadmoor, and he would very likely succeed, and Gideon knows it. So Gideon says nothing, and rides up here twice a week, and lets the whole county say what it likes about the woman at Nine Springs, because the county's saying it is cheaper than the assizes proving it. The fire settled. Somewhere out in the yard the horse moved. On the 2nd of January, Thomasin said. The Friday. Was he here? He was here from Thursday night until Saturday morning, said Lydia Vaux. I had a fever that turned inflammatory, and I do not remember Friday at all. Mrs. Peel tells me I was not expected to live through it. He sat on that chair for 32 hours and would not go down to the cross. And I have not been able to be sorry about it, and I have not been able to be glad, and I have thought about very little else since I heard about Ambrose Kiteley. Thomasin heard the whole shape of it arrive at once, the way a column comes right, the empty road, the folded meal bag, the dry little coroner, the words' want of relief, and one man who could clear himself with a single sentence, and would go to his grave before he said it. He will not tell them, she said. No, because it would put you in the dock. Yes, then we shall have to hang it on something else, said Thomasin, and she opened the ledger on her knee. Mrs. Vaux, what was insured on the granary? Lydia looked at her for a moment. Then she got up, without a word, and took down from the shelf a japanned tea-caddy with a broken lock, and set it on the table, and lifted out a bundle of papers tied with tape. The papers Tobias had put into her hands in the last week of his life, because he had nobody else to put them into. The policy was on the top. The granary at Stenick, with the corn therein, insured in the office at Bristol for £1,100. The premium payable at Michaelmas, in the name of the Earl of Cadmoor. Underneath it was a letter, dated the 22nd of November 1816, from the office to the Earl of Cadmoor, expressing their sense of the misfortune, and confirming that the loss having been adjusted at £840, their draft for that sum had been issued on the 26th, in accordance with his lordship's direction, and paid over as directed. Thomasin read it twice. Her hands were perfectly steady, which she remembered afterwards with a kind of horror. He never claimed, she said. He believed the policy had lapsed. He told me so. He said the premium was never paid after his brother died. It was paid, said Lydia. Sperrin paid it. Out of the estate in Gideon's name in October of 1815, and again in 1816, and never told him, and kept the policy alive, and had the burning of that granary in his mind for a full year before he ever struck the match. Then the money was paid to somebody. Thomasin turned the letter over. It says paid over as directed. Directed where? And there on the back of the sheet in the fair clerkly hand of a stranger was the endorsement. Paid by draft number 4111 on the 29th of November 1816 to the account of Josiah Reeve and Son, corn factors, of Bridgewater, upon the direction of S. Sperrin agent. Thomasin Reeve sat in a cottage on a drift road above the Coombe, 2 miles from a house with no doors, and looked at her own father's name. He was in the lane when she came out, standing at the horse's head with the reins over his arm and his hat off, and he had plainly been standing there some time, because there was frost in his hair. "How long have you known she was here?" he said. "An hour. And you came up that road alone. In the dark. In this. Yes, do you know what would have happened if you had gone off the drift at the Coombe?" "I should have frozen," said Thomasin, like Ambrose Kitely. "Which is, I find, rather the subject of the week." He turned away from her and stood looking down the white lane, and she watched his shoulders come up and go down once. "Ask it," he said. "Ask what?" "Whatever it is you walked 2 miles to ask. Everyone else in this county has had a year at me. You may have 5 minutes." "Very well." Thomasin put her hands into her cloak, because they had begun to shake and she disliked it. "Why did you marry me?" That was not what he had expected. He turned round. "You know why I married you. Your father was stopping the grain. My father was stopping the grain, and you had nothing left to sell but the name on that bond, and you sold it. I am aware. I drew the articles." She lifted her chin. "So you may stop apologizing to me twice a week with a fire in a parlor, and you may stop looking at me in that particular way when I come in from the cold, because I did not marry a man who had deceived me. I knew exactly what I was buying. What I want to know is why, in 5 weeks, you have never once told me a single true thing about yourself, when I am the only person in England who has read your accounts." "He stood in the lane because you would have gone," he said at last. "To where? To Bristol? To your sister?" "Anywhere. It is what people do." He said it without any self-pity whatever, which was somehow far worse. My own mother could not look at this side of my face for the last 2 years of her life. She used to speak to me from the doorway. I do not blame her. It is not a thing one can help. And when I understood in October that I should have to sell this house down to the boards to get the parish through the winter, and that the whole county had already decided I had burnt my own granary for £800, which, as it happens, is precisely the sum, though I did not know that until tonight. He stopped. Then he went on, more evenly. I decided that I would not ask anybody to stand in it with me. Not the servants, not Lydia, not a woman I had bought with a corn bond. It is my house. It is my parish. It is my face. I can carry all 3, madam, provided nobody is kind to me about it. There was a silence in the lane, of the particular quality that only happens in deep snow. "That," said Thomasin, "is the stupidest arrangement I have ever heard proposed by a man with a mortgage." He made a sound. It was very nearly a laugh. She walked up to him 3 steps, in the shoes he had made for her, and she took hold of his left hand, and she pulled the glove off it. He went absolutely still. The back of it was ruined, rope-scarred, silvered, the 2 smallest fingers drawn a little in toward the palm, and no longer straight. It was a hand that had gone into a burning loft, and got itself under a man's arms, and come out again, and it was cold. because he had been standing in a lane for half an hour. Thomasin turned it over and held it in both of hers and put it against the front of her cloak, which is where a sensible woman puts a cold thing to warm it. "Now listen to me," she said. "On Friday the 16th I am going to be sworn in that room, and I am going to hand Mr. Thirlwall a set of accounts, and I do not intend to say one word about that cottage, or about your brother, or about Mrs. Vaux, and neither will you, and neither will anyone else. We are not going to prove where you were. We are going to prove that it did not signify where you were. Because the man whom the law of this country required to relieve Ambrose Kiteley on the 2nd of January was not the Earl of Cadmoor. It was the overseer of the poor. And I am going to show that on that day he had 41 quarters of barley in the parish store at Stenick, and turned an old man away from it, and put it on a boat 3 days later. Gideon Vaux looked down at her. "You cannot show that." "I can if my father's purchase book says what I believe it says," said Thomasin, "and I mean to be in Bridgewater tomorrow night." She was in Bridgewater by 9 on the Thursday evening, having done 31 miles in a hired gig with Kitto Trewin driving, and the roads what they were, and she went up the counting-house stairs without taking her cloak off, and lit 4 candles, which in her father's house was an act of provocation on its own. Josiah Reeve came up at 10:30 in his dressing gown. "You are supposed to be a countess. I am supposed to be a great many things." She did not look up. "Where is the coast book for November and December?" "Tamsin, the coast book, father. He got it down himself." That was the first thing that told her he already knew. A man with nothing on his conscience sends the servant. She had it open for 40 minutes, and he sat opposite her the whole time in his dressing gown, in the chair he always took when he had already decided a thing, and for once in his life he did not say a word. It was all there. It was all there, because Josiah Reeve was an honest man of business in the only sense he understood, which is that he entered everything. On the 29th of November 1816, received by draft number 4,111 £840 to the credit of S. Sperrin upon the direction of the same. Between the 1st of December and the 5th of January, sold to S. Sperrin, on account of the parish of Stenick, 192 quarters of barley and 40 quarters of beans, at the going price, delivered by waggon to the parish store at Stenick. And on the other side of the book, in the coasting accounts, in the same clerk's hand, 5th January 1817. Shipped at Combwich in the sloop Fanny, 41 quarters of barley, in sacks, marked with the parish brand of Stenick, consigned to Bristol, freight and factorage on account of S. Sperrin, sold at Bristol the 9th, at 64 shillings the quarter. Thomasin put her finger on the line. "He burned the granary in October," she said. "He collected the insurance on it in your yard in November. He spent the insurance money buying corn from you in December, and charged the same corn to the parish poor rate as relief. Then he took the corn out of the parish store and sold it in Bristol at famine price through your own coasters in January, and made a third profit on the same sack. 3 times over, out of one fire. And on the day he turned Ambrose Kiteley away from that store, 41 quarters were standing in it, under the parish brand, waiting for the tide." Her father sat in the chair with his hands on his knees. "He is a good customer," he said at last. "That is all I knew. He is a good customer, and he pays on the nail. Did you ask where an overseer of the poor gets £840? No, did you ask why a parish that cannot feed itself is shipping barley to Bristol? No, said Josiah Reeve, I did not, because I did not want the answer, and because a factor who asks that question twice is a factor with no trade, and because I have known men do worse and be knighted for it. He looked up at her, and he was, she saw, quite grey. I did not know about the fire, Thomasin, as God hears me. I did not know about the fire. I believe you. Do you? He said it flatly. Then believe this too. If I bring that book into a coroner's court and read out those lines, I am done in this county. Every vestry from here to Taunton will say Reeve informs on his customers. I shall lose the parish contracts within the month, and the Bristol trade by the summer, and everything I have built since I was 19 years old goes with it. Yes, said Thomasin. I have thought about that all the way from Stenwick. And? She turned the coast book round on the desk so that it faced him. It is a small thing to do. It takes a second and a half. She had done it once before in that room, in November, with a bond, and it had cost her the whole shape of her life. You told me once, she said, that a ledger is the only honest thing in the world, because it cannot be flattered. You were showing off. You had had 2 glasses of port, and you were showing off to a girl of 16. And I have never forgotten it, and I have run my whole life on it since. She pushed the book an inch nearer to him. Well, here it is, Father. Here is the honest thing. It is going to be read out on Friday, by somebody. I would rather it were read out by the man who wrote it. The 16th of January was the coldest day of that winter, and there were more people in the yard of the Ram than there were in the room. Mr. Thirlwall had a worse cold than the week before, and no more patience than he had had at the beginning. He took the oath from Lady Cadmoor at 10 minutes past 10, glanced once at the 4 bound volumes she set on the table in front of him, and said, Madam, I do not want an oration. What are these? They are the accounts of the estate of Cadmoor from the 15th of October to the 14th of January, said Thomasin, made up by me from the vouchers, in my own hand, and sworn. And this, she put a single folded sheet on top of them, is an abstract. Read the abstract. So she read it, in a counting-house voice, without one word of ornament, and it is the only speech in this story that anybody in the parish of Stenwick ever remembered afterwards word for word. She read the pictures, 9 of them, sold at Wexley and at Bath between the 15th of October and the 9th of November, £1,940. She read the library, 2,200 volumes in 11 lots, £480. She read the plate, and the glass out of the long gallery, and the lead off the laundry roof, £51, and 4 chimney pieces, and the stair rail, and a mare bred in the house, 16 guineas, and, on the 6th of November, lot 41, a pair of carved and gilt doors, the property of a nobleman, £9 10s. She read the total, £14,230, of which 14,080 had gone out again in 11 waggon-loads of corn from Bridgewater, and 311 names in a parish book, weighed out on a public scale in the street on Tuesdays and Fridays, at £8 a head a week, since the 9th of October. Then she stopped, and stood with her hands folded and waited, and the room did not make a sound. £9 10s, said Mr. Thirlwall into his handkerchief for a pair of gilt doors. "Yes, sir, that is a very poor price." "It was a very poor sale," said Thomasin. "There were 4 sales in the county that week. Everybody was selling." The coroner made a note. Then he looked up over his spectacles at 200 people packed into an assembly chamber, and said, in the tone of a man closing a small door quietly, "This inquiry is not concerned with what the parish believes about the fire at Stenick Granary. It is concerned with how Ambrose Keightley came by his death. But I will say, for the benefit of certain persons in this room, that I have sat in this 100 for 26 years, and I have never yet seen a man defraud a fire office of £800 and then sell his own doors to give the money away. Call the next witness." They brought Job Netley in at 11. There was an argument first, and Sperrin's attorney from Wexley made the most of it, that the witness was totally deaf, that he could not be examined, that whatever he set down had been set down at somebody's dictation, that it was, in short, not evidence at all, but a piece of writing produced by Lady Cadmoor. Mr. Thirlwall listened to all of it, with his eyes shut. Then he opened them and said, "Mr. Barnicot, a man who cannot hear can still see, and the question I intend to put to him is what he saw. You may write your own questions, and I will pass them across myself, in your hand, and you may satisfy yourself that nobody prompts him. Sit down." So the parish of Stenick sat in perfect silence for 1 hour and 10 minutes, and watched a coroner and an attorney and a deaf carter pass a sheet of paper backwards and forwards across a table. There was no fire in that granary at 8 o'clock. The yard doors were open at 9, and I had barred them at 6. There were 2 waggons loading in the yard in the dark with no lanterns. The man who told me to go up and hold my tongue, and there would be 5 shillings in it, was Silas Sperrin, and I have carded for him 9 years, and I would know him in a coal hole. The fire began at the yard end, in the empty bays where the waggons had stood. Somebody came up the burning stair for me and dragged me the length of the loft and put me out of the loading door, and then went back in, and I had a hold of his hand, and it was burning. When the last sheet was read out, an old woman at the back of the room, it was Mrs. Yeo, who had been giving 3 of her £8 a week to the family next door since October, stood up and said loudly to nobody, "Oh God, forgive us." And several people began to cry, and the coroner did not stop them. And that is the moment, if you want to name one, at which the county of Somerset changed its mind about the Earl of Cadmoor. Josiah Reeve was sworn after the dinner hour. He came up in his good coat, with the Coast book under his arm, and he read out the lines himself, in the carrying voice he used on the exchange, and he did not once look at his daughter, and he did not once look at Sperrin either. The draft, 4,111, £840, 29th of November, to the credit of S. Sperrin, on the direction of the same. The purchases, December and January, on account of the parish, 192 quarters of barley and 40 of beans, delivered to the parish store at Stenick, and the shipment out of Combwich, in the sloop Fanny, on the 5th of January, 3 days after Ambrose Keightley went home with his bag folded under his arm, 41 quarters of barley, in sacks bearing the parish brand of Stenick, sold at Bristol on the 9th at 64 shillings the quarter, freight and factorage on account of S. Sperrin, Mr. Thirlwall, took off his spectacles. "Mr. Sperrin, you are overseer of the poor for this parish." "I am, sir." "On Friday the 2nd of January, what was standing in the parish store?" There was a pause of about 4 seconds. It was, Thomasin thought afterwards, the only genuinely interesting moment of the entire day, because you could watch a clever man arrive at the fact that both of his answers were fatal, and choose the wrong one anyway. "Nothing, sir," said Sperrin. "The store was empty. The store was empty." "It was, sir, then perhaps," said the coroner. "You will assist the jury as to how 41 quarters of barley bearing this parish's brand came to be lying at Cambwich on the following Monday." Silas Sperrin did not answer that question, then or afterwards. The jury were out for 20 minutes. They found that Ambrose Kitely, aged 71, died upon the 2nd or 3rd of January from cold and want of food, that on the day of his death there was relief corn in the parish store to which he was by law entitled, that it was refused him by the overseer, Silas Sperrin, and they added this themselves, and the coroner allowed it, and it was printed in the county paper on the Saturday, and copied in 3 London papers within the fortnight, that in the opinion of this jury the said Silas Sperrin had, for some months past, been selling the bread of this parish for his own profit, and that the parish had wronged the Earl of Cadmoor, who had sold his house to feed them. Sperrin was taken up that evening on a magistrate's warrant. He was tried at the Lent Assizes at Taunton on an indictment for arson and for embezzlement of the funds of the parish, and Job Netley gave his evidence there too, in writing, over the space of an entire day, and was thanked by the judge in open court. The property that could be got at was got at. £1,100 came back to Stenick, and a good deal of the rest to Cadmoor, and the mortgage on the Wexley farms was found never to have been executed at all, which took 2 years and a chancery suit to establish, and is a duller story than it sounds. The county came round the way counties do, all at once, loudly, and with no memory whatever of having been on the other side. There was a subscription got up in Wexley for the relief of the Stenick poor, which raised £200, and every farthing of it was handed over to the Countess of Cadmoor to administer, because, as the chairman said at the dinner, without the smallest trace of irony, her ladyship had shown herself to have a very sound head for figures. The Earl was put back on the bench in April, and made chairman of the new relief committee in May, and had to sit through a speech about his character that Thomasin said afterwards was the only time in their married life she saw him actually flinch. Lydia Vaux came down out of Nine Springs in March, on the arm of her brother-in-law, and was presented at Wexley as the Dowager Countess of Cadmoor, and the certificate came over from County Cork in June, and was entered in the parish register at Stenick, and nobody in the west of England ever said one word about it, because by then it would have been a very brave person who did. Josiah Reeve lost the Taunton contracts, as he had said he would, and the Bristol trade did not go, and by the following winter he had more business than before, because it turned out that a man known to have read out his own book against his best customer is a man other men like to deal with. He never said so to his daughter. He did tell 3 separate people at the exchange at length that she had got it from him, and the Dores came home. That was not anybody's plan. It began at Prowse's in February, when the thatch money came back and Prowse would not take it, and went to Wexley instead, and bought back a pair of inner doors out of the West Range for 11 shillings, and brought them up the hill on a hurdle. And then the Gollops did the same. And then it became a thing the parish did, quietly, over 18 months, without ever once discussing it. Whenever anybody had a little over, they went to a sale and bought back a piece of Cadmoor and carried it up the hill, and there is no record of it anywhere, because none of them would have dreamed of writing it down. By the summer of 1818, there were doors on 19 of the rooms. Somebody had begun the practice of chalking a name on the back of each one before it was hung, and Gideon Voss gave orders that they were never to be washed off, and they are there still. The great front doors came back last in the October and cost £4, and were carried up between 11 men. She found him standing in the court that evening looking at them, and she came and stood beside him, and after a while she said, "It is a very poor pair of doors. It is a very poor house." "It is a house," said Thomasin, "with a hall 40 feet long, 19 doors, 412 books, one Canaletto that Prowse's brother bought back for 30 shillings out of a dealer's yard in Bath, and will not accept a penny for, and 11 fires lit, and I have counted all of it, and you may check my figures if you like." He did not check her figures. He took his glove off, he did that as a matter of course by then, indoors and out, and had done since about the middle of February, and he held out his ruined left hand, and she put her ink-stained right one into it, which is how they walked in, that being the arrangement they had come to, and the only article either of them ever added to the 9 she wrote herself. Some houses are kept shut, because there is something inside them that must never be seen, and some are opened, board by board and door by door, by a man who would rather be thought a monster than let a parish starve, and by the woman nobody wanted, who read his accounts and understood him, and would not let go of his hand in a cold church while a room full of strangers laughed.